The plain stretched wide beneath a pallid autumn sky, a canvas of pale gray and gold where the wind ran unbroken for miles. Dust lifted in thin whirls across the horizon, chasing one another like restless spirits. Into that vast silence rode a solitary figure, his horse's hooves muffled against the hard-packed earth. The man's shoulders carried the weariness of miles, and his eyes, dark, steady, unreadable, held the storm of years that could not be measured by distance alone. Thomas was his name, though few called it with any warmth. The lines on his face were not yet those of age, but of solitude. His skin bore the mixed heritage of two worlds, one that marked him as foreign no matter where he stood. Among settlers, he was the half-breed who carried the blood of the people they sought to drive out. Among the native camps, he was the child of strangers, marked by suspicion, carrying a tongue that was not wholly theirs. He had learned long ago to dwell in the quiet margins, silent, enduring, unclaimed. As he crested the rise, the town unfolded below him, a thin ribbon of wood and smoke, framed by the skeletal arms of withered cottonwoods. There was no grandeur, here only survival hammered into boards and nails. Storefronts leaned against one another like tired men, their signs dulled by wind and grit. At the center stood the sheriff's office, square and stubborn, and across from it the saloon, its doors swinging in rhythm with the laughter of men already sunk in their whiskey. He drew rein at the edge of the main street, the creak of leather and the low nicker of his horse the only sounds. Faces turned, slow and measuring. A woman paused with her basket, lips tightening. A ranch hand, idling near the post, spat into the dust and muttered. The glances were not new to Thomas. He felt them as one feels the sting of sleet on bare skin, sharp, familiar, and impossible to shrug away. From the far end of the street, in the doorway of the mercantile, stood a woman with a shawl drawn tightly about her shoulders. Her hair was pinned with the care of someone who had long ceased to expect visitors, and her eyes were set deep in a face made older by sorrow rather than years. Evelyn was her name, though few spoke it often now. Widowhood had carved her life into silence, her husband taken by fever, her family scattered, her days measured by the scrape of chores and the creak of a rocking chair that faced an empty hearth. She watched the rider with a stillness that was not curiosity but recognition, the recognition of another marked by loneliness. She did not wave, nor smile, nor frown. She simply pulled her shawl closer, as though bracing against a wind colder than autumn. The sheriff was the first to break the town's silence. A stout man with whiskers thick as rope, he stepped from his office with the careful tread of one who weighed every action against the risk of unrest. "You looking for work, stranger?" he asked, his voice neither hostile nor welcoming, but lined with the caution of a man accustomed to keeping order with the least disturbance possible. Thomas dismounted slowly, boots striking the earth with quiet finality. He patted his horse's neck, then lifted his gaze to meet the sheriff's. "Shelter," he said. His tone carried no plea, only the flat truth of one who asked nothing more than what he needed. The sheriff considered. Lodgings were scarce, and none in town would open a door to the likes of him. His eyes wandered down the street, past the saloon, past the church, until they rested on the lone homestead crouched at the town's edge, a place of peeling paint and shuttered windows, where smoke curled from a chimney as thin and stubborn as its owner. "The widow's barn is empty," he said at last. "She's got space. You'll keep to yourself. Work for your keep if she asks it." Evelyn's head turned at the words. For a moment, her eyes and the stranger's met across the distance. Hers were cool, veiled, yet not cruel. His were dark, fathomless, carrying storms she dared not name. That evening, as the sun bled into the western sky, Thomas led his horse to the weathered barn at the widow's place. The air smelled of straw and old wood, of earth turned cold by the season. He set his saddle down without comment, the leather thudding against the planks. The barn was clean but bare. Emptiness echoed in its rafters, like the hush of a chapel long abandoned. Evelyn appeared in the doorway, her shawl draped like armor. The lantern she held cast a golden halo across the dust motes that drifted between them. She studied him as though measuring not his strength but the weight of his silence. "You may keep the horse here," she said at last, her voice low, steady. "And a space for yourself in the loft. The well's out back. No more." Thomas inclined his head, no protest in him. That will do. There was no warmth in her words, nor did he expect any. Hospitality, when it came from necessity, was a colder thing than kindness. Yet as she turned to leave, the lantern light touched her face, and he saw, just for a flicker, the tremor of something softer beneath her reserve. The night deepened. Wind rattled the shutters, and the widow returned to her house, its light dimming one room at a time until only the chimney glowed faintly against the dark. In the barn, Thomas lay against his saddle roll, listening to the groan of timbers, the rustle of straw, the far-off cry of coyotes. Sleep came slowly, edged by the knowledge of eyes that distrusted him, by the weight of roads behind and the emptiness ahead. Yet when his thoughts strayed to the woman in the shawl, to the lantern light in her hand, and the quiet in her gaze, he felt against his own guarded will that he was not entirely unseen. The town had offered no welcome. The widow had offered no warmth, but in the silence of that first night something fragile had taken root. The recognition, however faint, of two souls abandoned by the world yet bound by the same hush of loneliness. Emotional tone and realization. The opening establishes distance, suspicion, and exile. Evelyn and Thomas, strangers both, glimpse in each other not kindness, but kinship in solitude. Trust feels impossible, yet something unnamed lingers between them, lit by the quiet glow of a lantern in the dark. The days that followed were drawn long and brittle, like branches stripped bare before winter. The widow kept to her routines, her figure moving steadily from well to kitchen, from kitchen to yard, her shawl gathered close even when the sun fell warm. Thomas, silent as a stone in the river, drifted to the work that waited in her shed. Tools abandoned since her husband's passing, their edges dulled with rust, their handles worn with neglect. He said little, asking nothing. Yet each morning, when Evelyn stepped outside, she found the traces of his labor. A fence post straightened, a plow cleaned of its rot, an axe head sharpened until it gleamed again in the light. She never thanked him aloud, but the sight of those tools brought back from uselessness stirred something deep within her, a reminder that not everything broken was meant to remain so. The evenings fell heavy with silence. After supper, she took to her rocking chair by the window, listening to the rasp of wind against the shutters, the faint hum of coyotes in the distance. From the barn came the scrape of stone against steel, Thomas sharpening his knife by lantern light. The sounds carried across the night like the conversation they never had, steady, unbroken, necessary. But memory has a way of filling silence with voices long gone. For Evelyn, the rocking chair was no longer only a chair, it was the seat where her husband once smoked his pipe, boots resting easy on the hearth before fever dragged him into the earth. The house still held his presence in fragments, the coat folded in a trunk, the wedding dress pressed and hidden in cedar, the smell of tobacco that lingered though years had passed. Each creak of the rocker was like a heartbeat she could not silence. Thomas, in his own way, carried a different kind of absence. Each scar upon his body was a map of rejection, some earned by battle, others by hatred. He remembered the cold eyes of settlers who spat the word half-breed as if it were a curse, the averted glances of native kin who would not claim him as their own. Belonging was a fire he had warmed his hands by only briefly, always to be pushed back into the night. He bore it quietly as he bore the long roads and the endless sky. But when he sat alone, oiling the leather of his rifle, he felt the ache of a truth he never spoke aloud. A man without roots drifts until he dies, or until someone dares to anchor him. On the fourth night, rain came. A cold, slanting rain that rattled the roof and hissed in the dry grass. Evelyn lit her lanterns, the warm glow pushing back against the storm. She thought of her husband again, how he once stood in that very doorway, holding her close as thunder shook the walls. She pressed her shawl tighter, feeling the absence more fiercely than usual. Drawn by some instinct she did not name, she crossed the yard with the lantern in hand. The barn door groaned under her touch, opening to the smell of straw, damp wood, and horse sweat. The lantern's light cut through the dark to where Thomas sat hunched on a stool. His shirt lay discarded across a beam, and in the flickering glow she saw him tending to a gash along his side, blood seeping sluggishly through the cloth he pressed against it. For a long moment she stood in the threshold, torn between retreat and compassion. He looked up, his face half-shadowed, the stormlight glinting in his eyes. There was no plea in them, only the hard endurance of a man accustomed to suffering without witness. "You're bleeding," she said, her voice quieter than the rain. He returned his gaze to the wound. "It's nothing." Still, she stepped forward, her lantern swaying. The straw whispered under her shoes, and when she reached him, she drew a clean rag from the shelf. She held it out, but when he did not take it, she crouched beside him and pressed it to his side herself. Her fingers brushed the heat of his skin, and she felt the ridges of scars that told stories no one had been there to hear. The touch startled them both. His breath caught, and her hand trembled, but neither pulled away at once. She felt the strength beneath his silence, the weight of years carried in his flesh, and he felt the gentleness she had buried beneath widow's grief. The lantern light shimmered over them, softening the distance that had held them apart. At last she withdrew her hand, folding the rag into place. "You should rest," she said, standing as if the air itself had become too close. He nodded once, his eyes lowered, though something lingered in them, something unmasked for the barest instant. She left the barn quickly, lantern clutched tight, the rain striking her shawl in silver threads. Inside her house, she pressed her back to the door, breathing as though she had run. In that brief moment of touch, the walls she had kept around her heart cracked like old plaster. She had not meant to feel it, yet she could not deny it. The spark of life, fragile and dangerous, stirring where only silence had dwelled. In the barn, Thomas sat in the quiet after her departure, the rag warm against his side, the scent of her shawl still in the air. For a man long abandoned by every hearth he had known, the touch of her hand was a thing he did not know how to bear. He closed his eyes against the weight of it, yet in the darkness behind them he saw her face, eyes shadowed by sorrow, yet bright with something unspoken. The rain hammered on, but in both house and barn the silence had shifted. It was no longer only absence, no longer only exile. It carried the faint, dangerous whisper of possibility, emotional tone and realization. This chapter breathes with memory and fragility. Evelyn and Thomas remain haunted by the past, yet their first true contact, a fleeting touch, a scar beneath, trembling fingers, plants the suggestion that healing may be possible even if neither dares to name it. The storm came sudden, sweeping down from the mountains with a violence that seemed to tear the very breath from the land. By dusk, the sky had turned a bruised shade of purple, heavy clouds boiling low, their bellies flashing with the distant silver of lightning. The air grew sharp and restless, and the wind carried with it the scent of rain, a smell of wet earth and endings. Evelyn fastened her shutters against the rising gale, her hands steady though her shawl whipped about her shoulders. In the distance, thunder cracked, rattling the glass in her windows. The homestead groaned beneath each blast as though the very bones of the house might splinter. She lit every lantern she had, filling the rooms with a golden defiance against the coming dark. Thomas had returned from the shed, his broad frame streaked with dust from gathering the last of the tools. He said nothing, only placed the armload near the hearth and checked the door's latch. When the first sheets of rain began to fall, striking the roof in sharp bursts, he moved with a quiet purpose, bringing in kindling and steadying the rafters against the wind's assault. The storm left no room for distance. Evelyn found herself in the kitchen with him, the two of them side by side in the glow of the lantern, their shadows long and restless on the walls. He poured the grounds for coffee into a battered tin pot, and she set about mending the wick of a lamp that flickered weakly, threatening to die in the draught. At last, when the work was done and the night sealed them in, silence fell heavy again, yet not the silence of avoidance. It was the silence of two voices waiting, pressed close by thunder and rain, unable to remain mute forever. She sat at the table, the shawl drawn about her like a shield, while he stood at the hearth, the firelight painting his features in bronze and shadow. He stirred the coffee slowly, then spoke, his voice rough as if unused to shaping more than a handful of words at a time. "They don't want me," he said simply. Neither side ever did. Her eyes lifted, cautious. He did not look at her, but into the flames. "My mother's people said my blood was wrong. My father's kind said the same. So I learned to walk the space between." His jaw tightened and he set the pot down with a steady hand. "Loneliness is easier than hatred. At least it doesn't leave scars you can't see." The fire crackled. Evelyn felt the words stir against something in her chest, something brittle that had long refused to bend. She had known loneliness too, though of a different kind. Loneliness not of rejection but of absence, of loss that never loosened its grip. "My house," she said softly, her fingers worrying the edge of her shawl, "became a tomb the day he died. The same rooms, the same walls, but empty. I thought I would find safety here. Instead, I found silence. And silence," she swallowed, "can be as cruel as any blade." Thomas's head turned then, his eyes catching hers across the dim room. Neither spoke further, for there was nothing left to explain. Their solitude was not the same, yet it rhymed. Different griefs, one echo. The storm pressed harder. Wind clawed at the barn, and above the roar came the panicked whinny of horses. Evelyn started to rise, but Thomas was already at the door, pulling on his coat. "You'll be torn to pieces out there," she said, her voice sharp with fear. His reply was a calm glance, a half-smile carved from resolve. "They need me." Before she could stop him, he vanished into the torrent. Rain slammed the earth, soaking him to the bone within steps. Evelyn stood helpless at the doorway, lantern clutched in hand, watching his figure lurch through the sheets of water toward the barn. Lightning split the sky, framing him in an instant of stark brilliance. Broad shoulders braced against the storm, unyielding. Then darkness swallowed him again. Minutes stretched long, filled with the thrash of the storm and her own racing heart. She paced, whispering prayers she had not spoken since her husband's death. At last the barn door banged open, and Thomas staggered back, water pouring from his hair, his arms slick with mud and blood where some beam had caught him. She pulled him inside, shutting the gale behind them. He stood dripping on her floor, chest heaving, face pale with exhaustion. The wound along his arm bled freely, mingling with the rain. "Sit," she commanded, guiding him toward the hearth. He obeyed without protest, sinking into the chair as though every muscle had finally given way. She stripped the shawl from her shoulders, pressing it against his wound, her hands firm despite their tremor. For a moment, the only sounds were the hiss of the fire, the hammer of rain, and the uneven cadence of his breath. He looked at her, then his eyes dark, unguarded in a way that startled her. The strength he carried like armor had slipped. What she saw was not the warrior, not the outcast, but the man who had risked himself for creatures not his own, who endured, without complaint, who bore loneliness like a brand across his skin. Her breath faltered. She realized she was staring too long, too deeply. His lips parted, the words rasping low, half swallowed by fatigue. "Please, don't look at me like that." It was not command, but plea. Not anger, but fear. That in her gaze he might see hope he had long forbidden himself to feel. She drew her hands back slowly, folding the shawl against the wound with care. Her eyes lowered, yet the warmth in her chest lingered, treacherous and undeniable. The storm raged on, but within those walls the air had shifted. The silence between them was no longer empty. It carried something fragile, raw, and perilous. The possibility that two souls, broken in different ways, might begin to see themselves reflected in the other. Emotional tone and realization, storm-lashed, and intimate. The tempest forces Evelyn and Thomas into closeness, their story spilling into the firelit night. His plea, "Please, don't look at me like that," marks the first crack in his guarded heart, and the first stirring of something dangerous but tender between them. Clouds still clung low and heavy above the valley. Evelyn stepped outside to survey the damage. Fallen limbs scattered across her yard, the barn roof battered but standing, the garden drowned beneath shallow pools of rain. Beside her, Thomas moved with quiet efficiency, repairing, the hinge on the gate carrying away debris. The storm had soaked him through, and though she had bound his arm as best she could, the cut was raw and angry. Still, he never winced, never slowed. She wanted to tell him to rest, but the words caught in her throat. He did not seem the kind of man who knew how. By the time the sun pierced through the haze, he had vanished down the trail toward town. Evelyn watched his figure until the trees swallowed him whole, an unease curling through her chest. It did not take long for whispers to rise. At the mercantile, Evelyn overheard them. Two women bent over bolts of fabric, voices sharp as needles. "Have you seen him?" one asked. "That half-breed she's keeping under her roof?" The other clucked her tongue. "Dangerous, that one. Folks like him bring trouble. Doesn't belong here." They did not lower their voices when Evelyn passed, though their eyes slid to her with the smugness of judgment half disguised as pity. Later, Thomas himself returned from town with little to show. The supplies she had asked for were missing, though she could see by the set of his shoulders that the fault was not his. When she pressed him, he only shook his head once. "They wouldn't serve me," he said. No bitterness, no anger, only fact. The words sat between them like a stone. The children were crueler still. She heard them before she saw them, a gaggle near the well, their laughter sharp and mean. "Stray dog," one boy called. "Dirty blood," shouted another. Thomas stood a few paces off, his face unreadable as stone. Evelyn wanted to march too, the children's mothers to scold, to defend. But when she looked at him, she saw no permission in his gaze. He bore the insults as one bears weather, with resignation, as though to resist was wasted breath. That night, he lingered outside her, home longer than usual, rifle resting across his knees, watching the dark tree line. She pretended not to notice, but she did. He was there not for himself, but for her, for the widow who had given him shelter when no one else would. Inside, the house grew smaller each day. The storm had passed, but another kind of weather pressed upon them, quieter, heavier, without firelight. In the evenings, Evelyn took her seat in the rocking chair, the one her husband had once occupied. She told herself she sat there out of habit, but habit had nothing to do with the way her eyes strayed across the room. Thomas sat at the table, a knife in his hand, dragging stone against steel. The steady rasp, rasp, rasp filled the room, a sound both soothing and sharp. His silhouette bent over the blade, shoulders bowed in concentration, firelight throwing his scars into relief. Each time the steel caught the glow, her breath caught with it. She hated herself for watching, hated how her pulse quickened at the simplest things, the flex of his hand, the crease at his brow, the way his silence seemed to reach for hers. In the mornings, when he poured her coffee, his fingers sometimes brushed hers. Once, just once, she had not pulled away quickly enough. Heat had flared in her chest, startling, unbidden. She withdrew then, clutching the cup as though it might shield her. Her face burned, though she told herself it was only the fire's reflection. She lay, awake that night, listening to the house breathe, the creak of the beams, the tick of cooling iron, his slow footsteps pacing the porch. Something inside her shifted uneasily, like a locked chest stirring at its hinges. Thomas fought his own battle in silence. He had learned long ago the cost of reaching, of wanting. To hope was to invite the sting of refusal, the cruel reminder that he was always one step outside the circle. And yet, with her, the line blurred. Each time she glanced at him from her chair, each time her hand lingered a fraction too long when passing him a tool, his restraint frayed. She stirred a hunger that was not only of the body but of the soul, the hunger to belong, to be seen, to no longer walk the world alone. But the widow was not his to claim. Her grief was a ghost in the room, palpable as the firelight. To cross, that line would be to shatter something fragile, so he held his silence, clung to it like a shield. And still it betrayed him, in the way his eyes lingered too long on her face, in the way his jaw tightened when townsfolk spat their venom, in the way he chose the cold of the porch over the safety of sleep, keeping watch for dangers he could never name aloud. The days folded into one another, heavy with things unsaid. Words trembled on the air but never took shape. Glances lingered and broke away. Their silence was not peace, it was a battlefield, where desire and dignity clashed with every stolen moment. Evelyn knew the truth, though she dared not speak it. The storm had passed, but inside her home, something more dangerous brewed. Something no shutter could bar, no latch could hold. She feared it. She yearned for it. And in that tension, both of them lived, two souls pressed together by fate, circling the fire's glow, unable to step closer, unable to step away. Emotional tone and realization, quiet suffocation, taut with longing. Evelyn and Thomas live in the uneasy space between fear and desire. Though neither names it, both know their silence is no longer safe. The peace after the storm did not last. It never did, not in a land like this. Rumors came first. Riders spotted near the ridge, strangers in black coats asking after farms and livestock. Then came the warning from a neighbor, his face pale with dread as he rode hard past Evelyn's gate. "Outlaws," he rasped. "They're moving east. Sheriff won't lift a hand." By nightfall, the whispers had grown into certainty. The sheriff had locked himself in his office, claiming he was waiting for reinforcements that would never come. The townsfolk barred their doors, lamps extinguished, silence falling heavy across the valley. And Evelyn, standing alone on her porch, felt the truth coil cold in her belly. Her farm was a beacon in the dark, a widow, a stranger, easy prey. Thomas was already waiting when she found him outside. He sat on the porch step, rifle across his knees, face shadowed by the lanterns. Glow. His scars caught the light, a map of every wound he had endured and survived. He did not look at her when he spoke. "They'll come here," he said simply. "You know that." Evelyn's throat tightened. "And if they do?" He lifted the rifle, checking the chamber. The steel clicked with finality. "Then they'll have to walk through me." It began with hoofbeats, distant, low, like thunder rolling across the plains. Evelyn's heart seized at the sound. The animals in the barn stirred, restless. The night smelled of iron and smoke. The riders came in a blur of dust and shadows, their laughter harsh against the silence. Lanterns swung from their hands, casting jagged light across her fields. "Pretty little farm," one jeered. His voice slurred, with whiskey. "Reckon she'll pay her dues." Thomas stepped forward, rifle raised, every line of him drawn taut with resolve. The men reined their horses, surprised to find him waiting. "Ain't your fight, half-blood," one spat. "Step aside and we might leave you breathing." Thomas did not move. "This land isn't yours to take." The moment held, brittle, as glass, then shattered. The barn became their battlefield. The outlaws charged, their boots thudding against the earth, steel flashing in the lantern light. Gunfire cracked, ricocheting off the walls. Horses screamed. Evelyn's hand shook as she fumbled to bar the door, the smell of smoke stinging her nose. Thomas fought like a man carved from stone, each movement precise, ruthless. His rifle barked, then emptied. He swung it as a club, knocking one man sprawling into the hay. Another slashed at him with a knife, leaving a streak of blood along his arm. Still, Thomas did not falter. Evelyn's scream tore through the chaos as one outlaw lunged for her. Before he could reach her, Thomas struck, dragging the man down in a brutal struggle. Steel met flesh. The outlaw collapsed, groaning, the straw dark beneath him. The skirmish ended as suddenly as it began. The survivors fled, dragging their wounded, cursing into the night. The barn fell into silence save for the crackle of the lantern flame and Thomas's ragged breath. He staggered, one hand pressed to his side where blood seeped hot and dark through his shirt. Evelyn rushed to him, catching his weight as he sank. "Into the straw! Thomas!" Her voice broke, trembling with panic. "Stay with me, please. Stay." She tore fabric from her apron, pressing it hard against the wound. Blood stained her hands, warm and slick, slipping through her fingers no matter how tightly she held. Her tears fell onto his chest, mixing with the crimson. He caught her wrist, weak but insistent, his eyes locking onto hers. And in that moment, for the first time, he did not hide. There was no mask, no armor, no silence thick enough to shield him, only the raw, unguarded truth. His longing, his loneliness, the unspoken devotion etched in every scar. Evelyn's breath hitched. The world shrank to the inches between them, the flicker of the lantern casting gold across his face. She saw him, truly saw him, and it undid her. Her hand lingered on his skin, trembling not from fear but from the weight of recognition. The ache in her chest was no longer grief alone, it was something new, something terrifying. She bent her head close, her whisper breaking against him like glass. "Please, avert your eyes." But she did not pull away. Her hands pressed to his side, holding him, claiming him as though he belonged to her. And in his gaze she found the answer she had feared. He already did. Time stretched, fragile and electric, as if the fire between them might consume the very walls around them. Evelyn's tears streaked her cheeks, but she did not hide them. His breath came in shallow gasps, yet he did not look away. For years she had lived as though her heart were buried with her husband. For years he had walked as though no home could ever hold him. But here, in the straw and blood and lantern light, their truths collided. It was not spoken aloud, it did not need to be. Love had taken root, not in the safety of peace, but in the peril of fire and pain. By dawn, the barn lay quiet once more. The outlaws were gone, the sheriff still nowhere to be seen. Evelyn sat beside Thomas, her shawl wrapped around his shoulders, his head resting against the post. His wounds were bound as best she could manage, though her hand still shook with every knot. He slept at last, the harshness of his face softened in the glow of morning. Evelyn watched him, her heart unmoored. She knew nothing of what tomorrow would bring, only that something had shifted irrevocably. The fire between them could no longer be denied. Emotional tone and realization. Fiery, intimate, and dangerous. In violence and vulnerability, they finally face the truth. Love has taken hold in the ashes of fear, a force as unstoppable as the storm itself. The night after the attack stretched long and restless. Though the outlaws had fled into the hills, their shadow lingered. Evelyn could feel it in the way her neighbors peered at her windows, in the tense hush of the town square, where folks muttered about lawlessness, about weakness, about blame. The sheriff stood at the center of it all, puffed up with the false air of authority, his face pale with shame at his own inaction. By the time he came to Evelyn's gate, Thomas had already risen, bruised and bandaged, but standing tall. The sheriff's eyes slid over the wounds, the blood crusted in the hay, and for a moment he seemed to falter. But then his mouth hardened. "You've brought trouble here," he told Thomas. "Whatever vengeance they meant for us, they'll come, back and worse so long as you stay. You're no more than a spark in a dry field. We can't afford the fire." Evelyn stiffened, her fists curling at her sides. But Thomas only nodded, his jaw set, shoulders rigid as stone. "I never asked for welcome," he said. His voice was calm, but underneath ran the weary rhythm of a man who had heard these words too many times in too many places. "I'll be gone by dawn." The sheriff left with a mutter about keeping peace. Evelyn remained, staring at Thomas in disbelief. "You would leave," she whispered. "I always do." The hours until dawn felt like sand slipping through her fingers. Evelyn moved through the house in a daze, the fire burning low, her hands, clumsy as she tried to straighten blankets, sweep ashes, mend what little had been broken. Yet every task crumbled into stillness, her heart restless, her throat thick with words unsaid. When at last the first gray wash of morning touched the sky, she found him in the yard. Thomas stood beside his horse, the saddle cinched, his rifle tied against the pack. His shoulders bore the weight of more than wounds. There was a finality in the set of his stance, the quiet resignation of a man already turned toward exile. Evelyn stopped at the porch, her breath misting in the chill. For a moment she could only watch, every instinct warring inside her. To let him go would be safer, easier. It would silence the whispers, still the gossip, return her to the steady prison of widowhood. But the thought of the silence again, those long nights without his presence on the porch, without the low hum of his voice breaking the dark, made her chest ache. Her feet carried her forward before she could think. Thomas. He paused, his hand on the reins. Slowly, he turned. The weariness in his eyes cut through her. He looked ready to endure her farewell, ready to bear rejection with the same stoic acceptance he bore every scar. But Evelyn's voice trembled with something else entirely. "Don't go," she whispered. "Please, not like this. Not away from me." His brow furrowed, disbelief flickering. "Evelyn." She shook her head, words spilling from the dam she had built too long. "I thought I'd buried my heart with my husband. I thought grief was all I had left. But then you stood beside me even when it cost you blood. You fought for me when no one else would. And if you ride away now—" Her throat closed, tears pricking her eyes. "Then whatever life I have left will be no life at all." The silence between them quivered, stretched thin as glass. Thomas looked at her as if seeing something he did not dare believe, like a starving man staring at bread, afraid it would vanish if he reached. "I don't belong here," he said at last, his voice raw. "Not with your people, not with mine. Everywhere I go, I'm a shadow, a reminder of what doesn't fit." Evelyn stepped closer, her hands trembling, but steady in their intent. "Then belong with me." She lifted her shawl, the same worn fabric that had warmed her shoulders through grief's coldest nights, and with quiet resolve draped it across his. Her hands lingered, smoothing it over the breadth of his frame, not as a nurse tending wounds, but as a woman laying claim. Gesture of home, of trust, of love unspoken but undeniable. Thomas closed his eyes, his breath uneven. For a long moment, he did not move. Then his hand rose, covering hers where it rested at his chest. The walls he had built, the silence he had endured, cracked and fell in that simple touch. When the sun climbed over the ridge, they rode side by side. The town watched in uneasy quiet as the pair passed beyond the square. Some faces held pity, some disdain, some only tired resignation. But Evelyn kept her gaze fixed forward, her hand steady on the reins. She had no words for the sheriff, nor for the neighbors who whispered. Her choice had already been made. The horizon stretched before them, endless and uncertain. The road would not be easy. Outlaws still haunted the hills. Storms would come again. Hunger and hardship would test them both. But for the first time in years, Evelyn felt her chest expand with something more than ache. Hope. Beside her, Thomas rode silent, his profile hard against the morning light. Yet when the wind lifted, tugging the shawl around his shoulders, he turned ever so slightly toward her. Their eyes met, and in that fleeting glance lay a promise stronger than words. Not freedom, not safety, but no longer alone. The farm faded behind them, the town shrinking into a smudge against the horizon. Evelyn's heart beat steady as she reached for the reins, her spine straight, her eyes unflinching. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it with him, for love, when earned through pain and silence, was not fragile. It was forged, and it would carry them home. Emotional tone and realization, redemptive, bittersweet, yet quietly triumphant. Both find dignity, healing, and love, not as a gift bestowed, but as something carved from grief, earned through pain and chosen in defiance of the world's cold judgment.